Please join me in a pledge of allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
If not,
Yeah. Yeah.
Want to make sure you do that.
You make that motion.
Yeah, I make a motion to come out of executive session.
Second.
All in favor? Okay. Any adjustments to the agenda? None. Presentations. The first presentation, we've got two tonight. We've got the Economic Development Committee chairperson here, Conrad. Talk to us a little about the Waldeboro sign update. You were here 2 meetings ago?
Yeah, when half of you were not.
Yeah, right.
Here's 3 copies of this, printed out, a couple of notes. We talked about this, 2 meetings ago and voted on this new design for the gateway signs for Welcome to Waldeboro, both on Route 1. The third sheet is an abbreviated version of that sign, which can be placed at the intersection of Route 1 and Jefferson. So it's sort of tying into the other two, confirming that, yes, you can turn right here as well to go to the village. The only change that was made between the select board meeting 2 meetings ago and now is that we changed galleries to shops. That was a comment that we had, which we thought was a little bit broader. And there are a couple little tweaks that'll be made because the select board voted to have 2 versions of the sign, one with the 5-masted schooner and the other with the lobster boat. You see on the second page, the sign has a lobster boat and the first page has the 5-masted schooner. That second page showing the lobster boat is the one that would be placed as you're going south or westbound on Route 1. So the arrow has to be flipped. But other than that, just little tweaks like that. The proposed location, in fact, the mileage that is shown on that second sign is if you place the sign just behind, there's a snowmobile sign that's right before Delano's. You can think of that spot.
Yep.
It's from that
Crossing
location,
there, yeah.
which is close enough to the village that you start to see businesses in closer proximity as you're getting into town. But just far enough back that it isn't so congested with a lot of other signs. So we thought that was a pretty good location. Yeah.
The location of the signs, do we have to get DOT approval to put these out there?
Julie can
Because
speak to that.
You're moving them from the original places.
They're fine with it. We just have, it's a simple application.
Okay, yeah, I just.
As long as it's in the right of way.
I didn't know if anybody thought about that.
Yeah, that was one of the
That came
first
on the
things.
last meeting, yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah.
And then Public Works can deal with taking down the old signs.
Correct.
So what needs to happen now is we just need to send, I'm not sure quite how to do this, but we'll do a request for bids. We'll identify a few manufacturers and compare a couple bids and put it out.
How many signs are we gonna have? Just 2?
We're replacing the 2 gateway signs that currently exist on Route 1, and the third sign is just village standalone at the Jefferson intersection. So that's what we're looking to do here.
The Jefferson location is gonna have 1 sign.
Yeah, that's what, so there's currently really not much to indicate that that's where you turn to go to the village. I mean, there are signs here and there, but it's currently a bit confusing because you see signs that say Waldeboro 1 or Waldeboro this way. And it's like, well, we're in Waldeboro. What are you talking about? So it's trying to clarify that. That exact location must be confirmed. We haven't come to a decisive position on where that would go. Could it go in that median that divides Jefferson, or would it be before or after? That will have to be worked out.
Yeah, the medians are a no.
That's a no-go for the
That's a no-go.
median.
No medians.
So it'd have to be before,
Is there one gonna be north and south?
Right.
right?
My question.
Could you have one up
Yeah.
north and
Yeah.
south? That would make the most
That's
sense.
my question.
Like one up by Tucker's?
That was
or
my
one-
point, but I
one
couldn't
just-
get to it
Just north of,
apparently.
just, just north of here. Our
Right,
driveway here.
right. I mean, in my
Enough
view,
Time to move, turn too.
Yeah, but you also don't want, I mean, there's a lot of signs
Lot of
floating
little
around,
signs.
a lot of loose signs about. So the tighter it is to that intersection, I think the better. You know, like Jefferson, like Village, right? I mean, but as you're pointing out, if it's back from the intersection a little bit, it gives you time to turn.
Right.
Even one possibly by the end of 220 where it crosses, because that's gonna take you into the village as well.
Yeah,
So maybe another one of those village signs.
that could be too. That's a tough area because there's so many signs there currently. And I would actually recommend, since you're bringing that up, replacing the Waldeboro Business Association's sign, which is also at the Park and Ride lot, and it says Villages bubble, you know, this is in a sense is sort of replacing the Gateway sign and that WBA sign, kind of combining them. The size is our suggested size. The current sign is 4 foot high by 8 foot wide. This one would be, did I bring my tape measure? 6 foot roughly square. And what you can see on the screen a little bit better is that the sign's in two pieces. There's a top part and there's a bottom part. So that whole thing makes roughly a square. So try to picture from top to bottom being there, and that little arch would go just on top of that. That's kind of what we're talking about
Mhm.
here. And the same thing with that width. That detail at 6 foot by 6 foot square is pretty legible. You're not going to see it all in one go, but you're going to pass it a lot on Route 1.
It'd be great if we could take that top part of the sign and put it over the front sign we have out here.
Well, this art style should be the basis of all kinds of new
Right.
signage going forward, like for the park and
Mhm.
for parking lots and so on in the future.
And Conrad, it's going to say the town of Waldeboro welcomes you, and that just wasn't updated.
Which I marked on that. Yeah, we had a different version where it said the village of and downtown, but we liked village being on the arrow. So that's where we are. So what do I need from the select board now? Do we need authorization to do a manufacturer bid?
And then,
I'll make the motion for you to pursue, proposal for bid from organizations or businesses to get these done.
Okay,
The second.
and then those would come back to the select board and be voted on.
Any discussion on that? All in favor?
thank you.
That was the
Keep the train moving.
All right.
town office put out for the RFP.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, he'll give
Yeah,
me,
they'll give me
they'll give me
information.
the information and, I
I just
can
want to make that sure.
have it out on the website. We'll send it to all the typical
Yeah.
places we've used in the past.
Okay.
And great job. I love
Yeah.
the sign. I really
Thanks.
do.
Yeah.
It's so vastly different than,
I was trying to think, Con, when did we start working on this?
So
It was less than a year, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was about a year ago.
Yeah, so that's pretty fast in
know what?
government work right
Good to
there.
hear that.
it is, and, but.
That's
but-
fast.
But bear,
Decisions being made,
But-
decisions.
bear in mind that, it was approved to start like 3 years ago on the warrant.
Right.
So he only had it for less than a year and he's already. We tasked him with that. Remember when he came to do his report for the EDC and we said, have we got a project for you?
Yeah. All right,
Good
thanks.
job, thanks, Conrad. Our next presentation will be the Madomic River Shellfish Capacity Study. It looks like we have a guest here,
Casey from FB Environmental.
Casey from hi Casey.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Great. Great, shall I just launch into it?
sure.
Great, I'll share my screen. I have a presentation of the modeling project. And let's see here. Is everyone able to see that?
There we go, yep.
Great. So I'm Casey Dalton, Senior Project Manager, FB Environmental, and I conducted the Madomic River Shellfish Capacity Study, which concluded a few months ago, and I'm here to present the results to you all. So I have about 15 slides or so. I'll go over basically four topics. What is shellfish capacity? The data that were used, the model, methods and results, and conclusions, and then open it up to questions and comments. So first, just thank you to Maine Outdoor Heritage Fund, who provided funding for the project, and the town of Waldoboro, of course. Also, the Maine Coastal Observing Alliance, who provided their data, which were collected by volunteers. Abden Simmons for boat transportation for the sampling that we did on the project. Thank you. And also Dr. Damian Brady and Dr. Tom Kifney of UMaine Darling Marine Center for the scientific review and feedback during the project draft. So just some background, which I think you are all very familiar with. The Menominee River, of course, is some of the most productive clam flats in Maine. And the project, as I understand, was driven by concerns about introducing oyster aquaculture into the estuary. So what is shellfish capacity? Basically, it's how much shellfish is sustainable in the estuary. By shellfish, of course, mean the wild native clams and the potential oyster aquaculture that could be introduced in the future. So shellfish capacity really has four aspects that have been outlined in the literature on the topic. And only one of the aspects was dealt with in this project. So the four aspects are physical space. This is literally the physical space to put in an aquaculture facility, or however many are contemplated. Then there's production capacity, which is, in a sense, that's in terms of aquaculture, that's the stocking density, kind of how the aquaculture facilities are run. That was not the topic of this project. The ecological capacity, that is the capacity of the estuary to sustain shellfish, the level of shellfish that are in there, that was the focus of this project. And then there's also the social capacity. So social economic impacts, are they acceptable to the community? And that was not part of this project. So this is really just an ecological study of how much shellfish, that is the wild native clams, plus any introduced oysters, the estuary is capable of sustaining. So like any modeling study, there are limitations. This was intended to be a well-informed back of the envelope calculation. It was actually begun by my former colleague, Luke Frankel, who now works for another organization. And then I stepped in fairly soon afterwards. It seemed a lot more complicated than a back of the envelope calculation when I started. But in terms of modeling, it really is sort of that low to medium level model that was used here. The idea is to determine an order of magnitude impact from introducing oyster aquaculture. And the results are, of course, science-based predictions using the available data. But keep in mind, they're still predictions about a scenario that you're contemplating. It's not going to be 100% accurate. No model is. And all models, of course, can be improved and updated if new information, new data, or new methods become available. So let's just get into what the project actually, what happened in the project, what we did here. We started with a literature review. So that gathered both the scientific methods, the model, how to set up the model, as well as data from the Menominee and other estuaries. And I'll go into more detail on that soon here in the presentation. Then we gathered existing data. So that's literally the water quality data, the physical information about the estuary. And the sources there were, as I mentioned before, MCOA. And we also got some limited data from Dr. Leslie Rasher of University of Southern Maine, who conducted a study about 10 years ago in the estuary. And then we at FB Environmental did water quality sampling on 3 dates at 4 sites in the estuary. We did 2 in the fall of 2024 and 1 in the spring of 2025. So we did collect some limited amount of data ourselves. And specifically, we collected data on nitrogen, chlorophyll A, phaophyton, and total suspended solids, depth of the water, and water transparency. And then the modeling. So that, step one was data collection, step two was running the model. So this is a mathematical ecological model. These are equations that represent ecological conditions in the estuary. It was done in R software for anyone out there who is familiar with that. And so the modeling occurred in two steps. The first step was to basically build the equations, build the model of existing conditions. And like I said, I'll go into that in a little more detail, but we built the model first to look at what the estuary is right now. And then we added to that scenario, to the model, hypothetical oyster aquaculture scenarios at different levels to see what the effects would be. So going into a little more detail on the data that we used, we had physical data about the estuary, the surface area, the tidal range between low tide and high tide, and then multiplying those together, you get the volume of the estuary, which is an important characteristic. Water, the river inflow from the Madomic River, water temperature throughout the year, sunlight availability, all of those physical attributes obviously have an impact on what is possible, what is sustainable within the estuary. Just to give some examples, I have a couple of charts there. It might be a little hard to see the small text, but basically the top chart is water temperature. Along the bottom, it's simply day of year. And the red dots are the data that we had from MCOA and some of our data as well that we collected. And as you can see, during the cold months of the year, we have no data. So we had to look for data elsewhere, and we used Portland Harbor data, which had extremely high number of observations over many, many years. And we filled in the missing data from Portland, which was the best option that we could identify. And then we created for the model this curve. That's the model, right? Part of the model right there is the curve. Same thing here. This is simply sunlight availability, which drives the phytoplankton, the photosynthesis, which is primary production. So that's the kind of work we did to, gather data. We also had the water quality data. It's going to be a lot less dense than the physical observations. The main things that we were looking at were the nutrients, the dissolved inorganic nitrogen in particular. We did not have much of that data, so we also used total nitrogen to provide a more complete picture, and we estimated dissolved inorganic nitrogen from that. And the reason why dissolved inorganic nitrogen is important is that's what the phytoplankton take up when they're doing the photosynthesis, and it drives that primary production, which is the base of the food chain there. We also looked at the phytoplankton pigments, especially chlorophyll A, to estimate how much phytoplankton was in the water. And then we also looked at salinity, and that helped help us understand the dilution from the freshwater coming into the estuary and the exchange, the tidal exchange outside of the estuary as well. So the methods here. So we had basically three components here. The tidal prism is where we took the physical information about the estuary, and you can see down this map here, the outlined area, that's the Madomic River estuary, the study area. The tidal prism is the volume of water between low and high tides. That was basically the environment that was being modeled. You had some freshwater input into that tidal prism through the Madomic River, and then you had some exchange from offshore or from outside the estuary back and forth as the tide goes in and out. And there's something called a return flow factor. So we had to consider, we looked at the salinity in and out of the estuary and determine how much of the ebb tide that goes out then re-enters the estuary. And that was another important factor in terms of dilution of nutrients and how they cycle in that environment. As I mentioned before, we had the dissolved inorganic nitrogen and the chlorophyll A, which we used to estimate some of the basic drivers of the ecological conditions there. And then we had the biological aspects of the model. And these are all the ecological nutrient cycling rates, the rate of growth of phytoplankton, of zooplankton, the rate that zooplankton graze on phytoplankton, the rate that they both die off. These were all dependent on other factors like the amount of sunlight available, the water temperature, and so on. There were a lot of factors, and I won't go into any more detail than that. But basically, we had to do our research there and plug in numbers from the scientific literature for all of that. And that was basically to create the model of existing conditions, since there is no oyster aquaculture in the estuary now. And then we had to add some oyster feeding biological information and research about the clearance rates. So that's how much water they filter, how much material they remove when they filter that water, and then how much of it they spit back into the water, because they do that as well, and so forth. So we had to basically create a mathematical model of what the oysters are doing. And just some pictures here and some schematics to better illustrate the model. The estuary was considered a box model, so it considers this tidal prism from between the low tide and the high tide as just one homogeneous box. So the model considers that all the water in there is very well mixed, and that the phytoplankton, the nitrogen, all the components, the oysters, the clams, have access to the entire water volume there, which is a simplification. Obviously, you've got river flow in and tidal exchange out. And just another view, another schematic of the model. It's called an NPZD model, and that simply stands for nitrogen, phytoplankton, zooplankton, and detritus. And all of these arrows are, mathematical equations in the model. So you have phytoplankton, for example, which gets grazed on by zooplankton. The phytoplankton take the nitrogen. They have uptake of the nitrogen that helps them grow. There's the tidal exchange and river inflow and so forth. I won't go into every aspect necessarily, but it's in the report and described in more detail there. So the simulations were, the model simulations were run for 3 to 10 years generally. We used a daily time step. And so at each of these time steps, the model is going to create a new value for, how much nitrogen, how much phytoplankton, how much zooplankton, how much detritus is in the estuary at each time. And here's just another, little bit more of a illustration of the dynamics in the model. So you have the nitrogen represented here. It's a dissolved substance. You don't see it, but the nitrogen gets taken up by these little symbols here, which are phytoplankton. The phytoplankton are grazed somewhat by the zooplankton. And then both of those, the zooplankton and the phytoplankton, die off at a certain rate and become what's called detritus. And then gradually that detritus will remineralize, some of that will remineralize into nitrogen into the water column. And so that's the cycle that's happening, governed by water temperature, sunlight availability, and so forth. And the model is calculating that every day. There are also, of course, clams in the environment, wild native clams that are sometimes harvested, fish, plants, all kinds of other things. But this type of model kind of includes those implicitly. They're not explicitly calculated. And, I've got a larger area here saying that basically the clams are probably a net. They're removing some of the phytoplankton, zooplankton, detritus, and the nutrients associated with those. There's some removal of that on an ongoing basis due to harvest and growth of the clams. But the model just considers that as part of the equilibrium situation. So that was not modeled separately. But then what happens if you were to add in the oyster aquaculture? So the oysters would also be taking up some phytoplankton, zooplankton, and detritus. It would be basically ingesting that. It would be assimilating some of that material into the the body of the oyster. The oysters would then be harvested at some point. And then they would also be, though, as they're living in and growing in the estuary, they'd be putting a little bit of nutrients back into the water, just as part of their metabolism. And so that was my job, to figure out what happens at different levels of oysters. And, at what point does the nitrogen, for example, start to become depleted, or the phytoplankton become depleted to the point that it starts to impact the ecology of the estuary and it's no longer sustainable. So I'll step through here. Bear with me, about a little more than halfway through the presentation. But basically, as I mentioned before, the first step was to create a model of existing conditions. So to do that, we put in all of the data that we could find into the model without the oysters, and we ran it, and we saw how far off from the data how far the data were off from the results of the model. And then we did what's called a sensitivity analysis. So we varied a whole bunch of different parameters a little bit up and down, and we saw which parameters we might be able to adjust to bring the model to reflect reality more accurately. And that's what we did, basically. So we adjusted some of the many different parameters. We picked the ones that were the most appropriate, and we turned the knobs, turned the dials until the model basically reflected existing conditions. And so maybe not very exciting to look at, but it was for us when we saw that we had the three elements here: the phytoplankton, detritus, and nitrogen. This is a 3-year model run right here. And this dashed line in the middle is the average phytoplankton that we knew from data. The blue dots are the data that we had available, that with one red dot from University of Southern Maine. And, the phytoplankton is very close to that. Detritus is going to be about equal to phytoplankton. And you can see as the phytoplankton grow, this is the warm period of the year when the phytoplankton are more abundant. The nitrogen is lower because they have taken up that nitrogen and they're using it to grow. So that's just creating the existing conditions model. Then the next step in the process was to add the oyster scenarios. So in the literature, oyster feeding and oyster research deals with oysters per gram of dry weight. That's the oyster tissue. If you scraped it out of the oyster shell, put it in a drying oven, and you totally dried it out, that's one, then you see how many grams of dry weight you have for oysters. And essentially, luckily, 1 gram dry weight oyster is approximately 1 market size oyster. It could be a little more, a little bit less, but as a rule of thumb, that's how you can kind of make sense of the model numbers. So we simulated a wide range of oyster aquaculture in the estuary, going from 0 oysters to 50 million grams dry weight of oysters, or about 50 million oysters in the estuary. 50 million would be, a very large amount. I think from our report, that would be equal or a little bit more than all of the oysters, aquaculture oysters harvested in the state of Maine. So that's, kind of an extreme number. But we did that broad range of possible scenarios, and this is what we got back. This is just sort of an intermediate result, just to show you what the model is doing. This is a 10-year model run. Each of these lines represents a different scenario of oysters, going from 0 oysters here at the top to 50 million oysters here at the bottom. And what we're outputting in this chart is the chlorophyll A, which is a proxy for phytoplankton. So if you were, the model says if you were to put in 50 million oysters, provided they would physically fit in the estuary, if you were to put that many in the estuary, the model says after about 5 years or so, things would be, relatively within the normal range, but then gradually you would see a decline because the nutrients would simply be, diminished over time. So using those results, we had to then identify what is sustainable. So, I'll just show the chart here that's in the report that we use to make that determination. But conceptually, the idea is how many oysters could you would you be able to put into the estuary, and phytoplankton levels would still remain within their normal variability, so that it would still look like basically a normal environment, maybe a little lower than it was before, but it would be within the normal range of phytoplankton over several years and over a reasonable time frame. So the reasonable time frame part did require a little bit of judgment to decide how to interpret that related to the model. But as you can see from the chart here, we have three scenarios. We have the top scenario of 0 oysters. We have this scenario in the middle of 10.3 million oysters. And we have this blue line here of the 28.9 million oysters. And being a closed box model or an almost closed box model, it's a rigid type of a model. It doesn't allow for adaptive management. You know, if you were to put too many oysters in an estuary, they would probably not do well. They would grow too slowly, and probably at some point you would scale, you know, the farmers would scale back, or some of those facilities would close. Well, the model does not accommodate that. So there's no new equilibrium that's going to be reached in the model. So what that means is over about a 5-year time frame, we interpreted that as fairly reliable. Over a longer time frame of 10 years, you know, that's really pushing the model to beyond maybe what would be a conservative view of things. But basically, we use that 5-year and 10-year cutoff to determine a sort of a range of what the shellfish capacity is likely to be. And while still remaining, you know, roughly, or at least ending in this case, at the low point of the normal conditions. So you can see within 5 years, all of these scenarios are pretty much within this normal range. They dip down just a little bit here, but that's, you know, probably not that significant. So we had this 10.3 as a conservative amount, this 28.9 million as a, you know, aggressive amount, if you will. And I basically made the call that a midpoint of that would be the result that we were going to draw from the model of 19.6 million oysters as a predicted capacity in the Madomic River. And that just repeats that right there. So just some conclusions here at the end. To begin with, management decisions and adaptation are key. So, you know, I just presented a mathematical model of ecological conditions, but and of course that can help inform management decisions. But then when decisions are made and things happen in the real world, it's really important to follow through and monitor what actually happens. You know, the model may prove accurate. It will probably be a little bit off one way or the other, and it's important to monitor what happens and don't just rely on a model without, you know, watching what happens after management activities have occurred. Oyster aquaculture density and techniques actually really matter. This came up in the research, that there are different ways to do oyster aquaculture, and some of those ways will have more of an impact, remove more nutrients from the estuary, and others will remove less nutrients. For example, there are two types of oysters at a genetic level, diploid and triploid. It's two different ways of running an oyster aquaculture operation, and triploid oysters have less of an impact by about 30%. They don't need to take as much nutrients from the system that the diploid, which is the normal type of oysters, would. So, you know, that can make a big difference in terms of capacity. There are also different timing approaches in terms of harvesting oysters. There is a harvest when ready, so-called. That means when oysters individually get big enough, they're taken out. And then there's another approach, which would be harvest all at once, where you let them grow, and some of them get, you know, much larger, and some of them don't quite get as large. But the larger the oyster, it actually filters much more water. So doing a harvest when ready has less of an impact and reduces, it doesn't reduce nutrients as much as the harvest all at once approach. And the other another important conclusion here was it would be really helpful to collect more water quality data. As I mentioned, dissolved inorganic nitrogen is what the phytoplankton is taking up. We had a total of 3 sample dates of that data. That's really not that much. We used total nitrogen, which has been collected for many, many years, and we estimated dissolved inorganic nitrogen from the total nitrogen, but that's an estimate. It's one step away from the actual data, the actual, the substance that the phytoplankton are taking up. So it's not quite as reliable. And chlorophyll A data, chlorophyll A is a pigment that's produced by the phytoplankton. We had very little data there as well. So, having those 2 parameters over several years and across all seasons, I think would really be helpful in terms of shellfish management in the Madomic River. And if it were possible to actually monitor phytoplankton itself, like count the phytoplankton, that's possible through, taking net tows and literally counting the phytoplankton, identifying what's there. That would be very helpful data, but more time consuming. And then I'll just, as a final concluding thought, remind everyone that the model addresses really only ecological effects, right? So there's still a physical space component to capacity in the Madomic. There are competing uses in those spaces, navigation, lobster boats, everything else that's happening. This model did not look at that at all. So that's a whole separate category of capacity. And then, of course, also social and economic impacts were not considered in this model. The project produced 2 reports. There's a data gathering literature review memo and a final memo that reports all this in much more detail. And that's it. That's my presentation. Open for any questions that the select board may have.
Mike? Yeah, it's an awful lot to digest. The one thing that stood out from the report was the 19.6 million grams. Well, first of all, is that grams per year?
That's a very good question. It would be grams total, right? So when you have oyster aquaculture, you can have some young oysters, you can have some larger oysters, and it really depends on how they're managed. You would need to translate the grams of dry weight into what's there, in the estuary, but it would basically be a steady state. So you're assuming that the larger oysters are being harvested, younger oysters are being rotated in, and the net is going to be the 19.6 million grams dry weight.
So that's the net harvest would be 19.6 million grams.
In the estuary at one time,
Well, that's what's in the estuary at one time.
right?
Okay.
So just for Casey, just for clarification, but that doesn't account for where you could not physically put them, correct? So as like when you do like a layover map of where it's not allowed because of intertidal or it's navigation or any of the things that are an issue, that number gets exponentially smaller, correct?
That is quite possible. I did not
Okay.
actually, that wasn't part of our project, so we didn't actually look at that.
Right.
But yes, that is quite possible that if you take out all of the, the physical space in the estuary where it is not allowed, or maybe there are restrictions for water quality or whatever, it very well may be that it would be impossible to fit that many in there. The 19.6 is really just the shellfish food, the phytoplankton, and the zooplankton and the detritus that they produce. That amount of food in the estuary would support 19.6 million grams dry weight of oysters, but you may not have the space to put them in there. So that's right. They may not that may not be achievable for that reason.
Abden?
Did you take data in for our landings for soft shell clams?
Sorry, could you repeat it? A little hard to hear.
Saw that in there. so-
Did you take in data of our soft shell clam production from the river?
No, we didn't. No, that was not considered explicitly in the model. The landings were considered part of existing conditions. So it's implicit in the existing conditions of the model. So
So if we produce, say, 300 or 400,000 pounds of clams a year, that would significantly impact that number of oysters as well, wouldn't it? Would it not?
what I would say is that would only if the landings changed dramatically. So if the clam landings increased over
Mhm.
what they are now, then you would have to take that away from the oyster capacity that was calculated. If they remain more or less within the range that they've been in over the years, and I know they've gone up and they've gone down, that wouldn't have an effect in terms of the model. The model already considers that in the existing condition calibration that we did.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Well, to some extent, it's a zero-sum game. Phytoplankton and nitrogen and the other elements that are in there represent the total food source for clams, shellfish, and clams, oysters, and lobsters. And lobsters very indirectly, admittedly. I guess what I thought we were going to get was the impact of oyster farming on landings of clams. If you put, say, 19.6 million megagrams of oysters in the estuary, what effect is that going to have on the landings? How much, and assuming the same take rate, not take rate, assuming the same percentage of the clams come out each year, how much lower will the clam landings be?
In terms of food, the model is predicting the clams will have enough food up to that level. With some uncertainty, right? Because if we had better data for the dissolved inorganic nitrogen and chlorophyll A, I think I would be more confident in the number that we provided. In the report, I mentioned that up to 5 million grams dry weight of oyster aquaculture would certainly be, as far as the model can tell, would certainly be sustainable. The effects on water quality would be within the margin of error of those water quality samples. So in essence, you would not be able to see, according to the model, you would not see any effect at all. When you go over that to the 10 million or so grams dry weight of oysters, I think that is a conservative estimate. And that would also be unlikely to take food away from the clams. So you would still have the same, in terms of food resources, you would still have the same ability to harvest the clams that you have now. And then once you go over that, you're starting to get a little less certain. The higher number that I gave, which is close to 30, that's a very aggressive number. The model says that would be okay, but given that there's really not that much, the data in terms of water quality was not that robust, I would not feel confident in that. So that's why we went to the midpoint of 19 or so million grams. And even that, that's what the model says. And, from a management level, provided that amount of oysters would actually fit in the estuary, one could argue that maybe it would be better to take a conservative approach and see what happens and confirm that the model is accurate, that up to 10 million grams dry weight of oyster aquaculture is sustainable.
And
That's a
Casey-
management issue. That's a management issue. So we didn't you know, and I thought about addressing that in the report, but really that is beyond the model. The model is just, you know, what the model predicts. Yes, there was another question?
You didn't anticipate or even think about during this that the oysters would be suspended in the water column, right?
Well, we did, yes. I mean, we
Okay.
assumed that the oysters would be suspended in the water column in the tidal prism. Right?
Okay,
So they're going to be between.
I was just curious.
Yeah, no, that was an assumption. They could be on the bottom in the intertidal range as well. And that would still be, you know, the model would still be applicable to that as long as they're in that between the low tide and high tide.
Mike?
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to obviously read the document. It was just handed out, but I think it would be of real significant interest to those people whose livelihood depends on clamming, to have some sort of statement about what you just said about being within the margin of error, or even a more positive statement that a oyster population of X million grams would not appreciably reduce the oyster catch in the clam take in the estuary. If you could make a statement in that for or against, I don't know what the answer is, but if you can make that statement, that I think would be highly desirable to our constituents.
Sure, that's in the report, and I will defer to what I wrote in the report in terms of the exact wording, because I thought about it carefully as I was writing it, but that is in there, the comment about, you know, up to 5 million grams or so being, you know, definitely sustainable, because that's probably within, in terms of the model. The model says that's definitely sustainable. The result would not even be, you know, visible in water quality monitoring. It would be within the margin of error. That's in the report, as well as the rationale for, you know, the conservative and the aggressive scenarios. And I also go into fair amount of detail in terms of the fairly small data set that we had available to calibrate the data. And I think that is also, for those that might want to take a conservative approach, that I think is relevant.
But Casey, also, like you said, the physical limitations haven't even been considered in this.
Correct. Yeah. In
So-
fact, yeah.
What would be your recommendation for next steps?
I think a good next step would be to map out the existing uses, the available space that aquaculture, you know, that would be available to aquaculture, and you know, take that view of it as well, because, and then I think it would also be important to talk with folks who you know, work with oyster aquaculture, so they would be able to advise as to, you know, what density they would likely put oysters in. That would make a huge difference in the surface area that they consume, of the, you know, that they occupy in the estuary. But I think having a map of all the different uses would be valuable. And additional, I would also say some additional water quality if possible. You know, if this is likely to be an important aspect for the Madomic River estuary, I think the dissolved inorganic nitrogen and chlorophyll A data will be valuable moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. Well, because I think that's,
Expand this.
yeah, I think this was never intended to give a definitive yes or no. This was intended to give one part of it. So I think in terms of, this is not one giant step for man. This is the first baby step, a very small piece.
Yeah, and you know, if it sounds like physical space in the estuary is going to be more limiting than Well, it does sound like that. It sounds like the physical space in the estuary is going to be more limiting than the food resources. I think the take home from the model could be, after you do a little more analysis on, what space is feasible, that it's not going to be the food resources, it's not going to be the phytoplankton that is going to be the limitation. It's probably going to be something else. Probably going to be the physical space. And, then there's also the whole social economic impacts, which is, of course, beyond the scope of this study. But it's the food, in terms of phytoplankton, primary productivity, it seems like it's a very productive estuary with ample food resources for shellfish.
One thing it does show, which kind of surprised me, is if we do, which we do actually right now have a massive set of seed clams in the river, is if there's enough feed in the river to feed those clams that, we could be potentially back up to 600,000-700,000 million pounds of clams coming out of the river a year versus 300,000 to 400,000 pounds. So I think it shows us plenty of food for them, even if we don't have oysters in the river.
Sounds
I was
really-
concerned there wasn't enough food in the river for what we were harvesting now. That's all we had the ability to feed was 300,000 to 400,000 pounds a year at this time with, climate change or whatever, or droughts or whatever's.
The river's too clean.
The river's too clean. I mean, it's some, we've got it cleaner than it's been in the last 25 years and our clam production has dropped. So.
Well, that is an interesting observation, and I touch on that in the report as well, because I know the sewer district does land application of their final effluent, whereas in other estuaries it's discharged after treatment, so it's sanitary, but that's nitrogen, along with all the other pollutants that might be associated with the wastewater.
Used to have down there.
And that's not in the Madomic River. That's not reaching the Madomic River.
Right, because ours is land-based now versus it was on the
It
river.
was on the river.
Right. When did it get moved?
About 20 years ago.
Yeah, but yeah.
2005.
early
Yeah, and I cite that in the report when that happened. I also note that in Boston, they did something similar. They took their wastewater effluent and sent it way, way offshore, so it wasn't going into the harbor anymore. And that helped me determine a total nitrogen to dissolved inorganic nitrogen ratio. But as I'm sure many of you are aware of, there's not only nitrogen in the effluent. There may be a lot of other things that you really don't want to be putting into the environment as well that can make it through wastewater treatment. So, personally, I think that's probably a net positive.
MSC. Vibrio.
Well, thank you, Casey.
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you all very much. Reach out if you have further questions in the future. And once again, thank you very much.
I'll give your email to Mike.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Well,
I believe that probably step towards getting more grants to expand the study.
The mapping would be really, I think the mapping overlay would
Yes,
be
that would
really phenomenal, because that's going to, just based on state rules alone, is going to rule out most of the spots that you would,
Well,
like
I think we,
Back Rivers. That's your river, right? That's out. We already know that.
The Narrows are out, you never get a raft of oysters in there.
So there's a lot to it, but
we have, I believe, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think we have 1,300 acres of clam flats in the river, so
Mhm.
that narrows it down big time.
But at least, and it proves that the testing is really important. So maybe that's something Shellfish Committee can start and use some of that conservation as maybe more testing would be, because
I don't think we have an issue with testing, it's the issue with money to get the test done.
right, right. It's what test do you want to run
Mhm.
and how often do you want to do it? And, we had the funding at one point to do some, at least DNA testing, and maybe we could have redone. But we'll figure it out. We have Kate.
No pressure.
Kate will get her first million soon. It's okay.
It's interesting.
That's no.
It's interesting to note that he mentioned the city of Boston, and I worked for Boston Water. Well, it was the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority that took care of the city of Boston. They had an immense flounder fishery in that town, and you could go out and get a boatload in a day of flounder. My project was to remove sludge from the harbor, and the day that plant opened, the season after we opened that plant, the flounder fishery collapsed.
Wow.
It just collapsed. You couldn't catch another flounder. It was unbelievable how quick it happened. So I want to see that in this report, really.
Oh,
You know, how much can we expect the clam fishery to be impacted?
Mhm.
And you should include lobster, because there's a lot of lobster.
Well, and
Pots out
that's, I
there,
think
and
that's
they
part of
take-
what's coming up.
They take nitrogen and chlorophyll out indirectly, the lobsters indirectly, of course.
Science class.
Mm,
you have homework.
Okay, moving on, public hearings, we have none. Citizen comments,
I was telling
anything
Kate
from
she
our
could-
citizens? The two that we have here? Select board comments.
Good. I'll sit here.
We're still happy we've got some roads currently being paved,
Good.
and I'm hoping the weather holds, because I see there's some upcoming projects for November.
I just got a couple quick things, just keep the Maxwell family in our prayers. We lost Rebecca Maxwell a week or so ago. She was a long-term town clerk here in the town of Waldeboro. She's been around Waldeboro her entire life. She was a select board member on budget committee, very involved with the fire department, the auxiliary. So just keep the Maxwells in our thoughts and prayers. Also, I actually physically attended the last school board meeting last Thursday. I spoke. There is a lot of conversation amongst the school board on, like I've mentioned this before, about going for a bond to do some major overhauls, which I agreed has to be done at the high school. I cautioned them and asked them to each one go see their select boards now and don't wait until 2 or 3 weeks before referendum. Start greasing the skids, getting out there and talking to people about it. Even if you don't have a complete plan yet, at least get us thinking about it. So I know that after that meeting, the Warren members, they go in tomorrow or Wednesday to talk to the Warren Select Board. So we should hopefully see some of our our school board members here in the next week or so. Telling us what their plan is. That's all I have.
Elm Street and Mill Street, if you happen to go by there today, are totally reclaimed, I would say. So there will be paving on Elm and Mill this week. Elm will be done completely. Mill's going to have its base down. And then the top coat and then the sidewalks will be done in the spring, just because we are unfortunately running out of time. But Mill will be closed to through traffic, but if you need to get to the doctor's office or you need to get to your home, you can go there. But we just ask that people who are just driving through to get from one side to the other, seek an alternative route, either Route 1 or Main Street. The Waldeboro Children's Program, the Boxes of Joy that we distribute every Christmas, just the wish list is up and active. There's a list for Amazon and a list for Walmart that went live today. We had 172 folks sign up for turkey baskets. So 172 families in Waldeboro. And that's through the Ecumenical Church. And then the town of Waldeboro does the Christmas baskets. So we anticipate that number may grow, at least for the Christmas baskets. The sign up for the turkey baskets for Thanksgiving has ended, and we cannot add any more people to that list. So just be aware of that. And that's all I have. Oh, and the clerk might want to tell you, how many voters did we have for the,
A lot.
it was busier than I think people anticipated.
Yeah. We had more visitors more residents than we had to dip into other ballots to fulfill how many people that came out.
Mhm.
So approximately 1,350 people were here physically on Tuesday,
Wow.
give or take.
Yeah, which was a lot.
Gee, how about a motion to approve the consent calendar?
So moved.
Discussion? All in favor? Aye. New business, 10.1. Looks like we have some criminal forfeitures coming.
We
up.
have some criminal forfeitures from the state of Maine. And this is for Lincoln County Unified Criminal Court Docket CR 24-238 with a defendant Sean T. Brewer and a defendant Hollis Stanley Owens. And this is for this is the results of a DEA action in our community. I will tell you that I have never seen this before in my tenure here, nor has Chief Lash. But each one, we would be getting $1,771.50 from each of these. And that goes into a dedicated fund for law enforcement. And this is because our police department was involved in this action. So in order for us to let the court know that we will accept the funds and use them as is stipulated under state law, you have to vote to accept these funds if they are awarded.
I'll make the motion to accept the court doc CR 24-238 and 24-239. As outlined in the letter.
Second.
Discussion on it? All in favor? Aye. Against, none. Old business? We've got none on the agenda. Agenda items for the next meeting?
You're gonna have CEO items.
Yep.
And also a visit from Waste Hub.
That's still in the moving process.
It's still in the process. Yes, he's finally able to come down and actually have a discussion about potential hauling of our waste
Mhm.
from our transfer station. Mike Carroll from Waste Hub is coming, and I'm sure you can get an update on where they are in their process for accepting our trash.
Anything else?
Make a motion to adjourn. Second.